All right, so it is now 1 p.m. I want to again thank everyone for joining us today. And I'm going to switch over and introduce Nicole Breslow, who will be helping to moderate today's webinar. Have a great session, Nicole.
Great, thank you, Ashley. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on micro-credentialing and teacher professional learning. Our webinar is co-hosted by the Regional Educational Laboratory Northeast Islands and Digital Promise. REL Northeast Islands is one of 10 regional education laboratories that conducts applied research and trainings with the mission of supporting a more evidence-based education system. Digital Promise is a nonprofit that works at the intersection of education leaders, researchers, and technology developers to improve learning opportunities for all and close the digital learning gap. REL Northeast Islands conducts our work primarily through collaborative research practitioner partnerships and alliances. My name is Nicole Breslow, and I co-lead one of these research alliances, the Professional Learning and Development Research Alliance, with my colleague Candice Bocala. You'll also be hearing from Candice today. The goal of our research alliance is to help district leaders in our region make evidence-based decisions about the selection, adaptation, and scale-up of professional learning and development programs and strategies. Micro-credentialing has come up as a topic of interest for district leaders in our research alliance, and this webinar was developed in response to some of their questions. This is our agenda for the webinar. First, you'll be hearing from Jennifer Kabacher, an expert in micro-credentialing from Digital Promise. She'll be giving an overview of the micro-credentialing field, including the theory of change and key components of a micro-credential. She will also describe existing research on micro-credentials, as well as some of the challenges and opportunities with implementation. Next, you'll be hearing about micro-credentials in practice. Jill Snell will share her experiences implementing micro-credentials in the Baltimore Public Schools, and will discuss some of the lessons learned. We'll have time for a couple of questions after the first presentation, and then a more extended opportunity for Q&A after the second presentation. Please share your questions in the chat as they come up. Candice and I will keep track of them, and we'll pose them to presenters at the appropriate time. We hope that you'll leave the webinar today with a better understanding of what micro-credentials are and the research base that supports them, as well as some practical ideas for how you might implement micro-credentials in your district. We're excited to welcome our presenters, who both have a lot of helpful experience and knowledge to share with you all about this topic. Jennifer Kabacher is the Director of Educator Microcredentials at Digital Promise, where she leads the development of a competency-based ecosystem for educator professional learning. Jill Snell is a resource teacher in the Office of Organizational Development at the Baltimore County Public Schools. She supports the growth and development of teachers in the district's 175 schools and is a Digital Promise microcredential teacher ambassador. And with that, I will turn it over to Jennifer to begin presentation.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. All right. Thank you so much for having us. We're really thrilled to be co-hosting this webinar with the REL. And excited to share with you the progress that we've made thus far on our educator microcredential ecosystem. However, I must admit that the most exciting part of these webinars, I think, is hearing directly from the practitioners on the ground. So I'm so happy that everyone will be able to hear from Jill after I talk for a while. I will be doing my best to pay attention to any questions that come up in the chat, so I'll try to pepper those in as we go through. However, to start us off, I believe there should be a poll in here. There we go, yes. So we'd love to learn from everyone how familiar you are with microcredentials. Is that something that's brand new to you, something you're somewhat familiar with, or something that you've been doing for years and you've earned several and you consider yourself to be sort of an expert here? So we'll give folks a few moments here. It looks like most folks on the line are somewhat familiar, which makes sense because you've clearly heard of microcredentials to get you here, but may not have on-the-ground experience with them or might be looking to learn more, and that's absolutely the goal of this. I think we can end the poll now. I haven't seen the numbers change a little bit, but thank you all so much for responding. So to start us off, I wanted to talk a bit about how we got to micro-credentials. So at Digital Promise, micro-credentials come for us from a deeply held belief that educators are by definition continuous learners. They go through their credentialing program or their certification program, but they're by no means at the end of their learning. In fact, the vast majority of states and school districts require educators to actually engage in formal learning throughout the course of their careers. So they really are constantly developing and evolving even once they exit their teacher preparation program. However, micro-credentials are meant to really address sort of three what we see as shortcomings in the current professional learning system. The first is that the professional learning systems traditionally and typically only recognize formal learning, so learning that educators do in seminars and workshops, and those more sort of formal settings that are often mandated or required by their districts or states. However, we know now more than ever that educators are learning in lots of informal places too. A lot of it is on the internet, on YouTube and Twitter and other virtual learning communities. And then a lot of it actually happens in your classroom, whether it's blood, sweat, and tears and trial and error, or with the teacher next door that you're co-teaching with, or you have a mentor-mentee relationship. There's lots of different options for how teachers learn informally as well now. The second is that we know that most of the systems also pay attention to the time that educators spend in those formal learning environments. And research for decades now shows that time or seat time is not the most effective way to understand learning for students, and it's certainly not the most effective for understanding how educators or adults learn either. So micro-credentials are attempting to shift both the conversation around professional learning or to recognize, I should say, both formal and informal learning opportunities, and two, to shift the conversation about teacher professional learning from seat time based to competency based. And then the third thing is that at the end of the day, we believe that micro-credentials provide almost a digital portfolio of everything an educator knows and is able to do. So as an educator collects all of their micro-credentials, they're able to have a form of currency that they can use in hiring discussions and promotion discussions to highlight themselves as resources in their buildings. And so these micro-credentials can become meaningful and valuable for the educators as individuals as well. So that takes us, of course, to micro-credentials, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. So when we think about building this competency-based system, right, the system that no longer focuses explicitly on seat time for educator learning, but instead looks at demonstrations of competence, we think about it in this triangle. So the top of the triangle are the desired outcomes, the things we know that we want educators to know and be able to do because there's research to back it up. So for example, there's no research to back up teaching algebra while standing on one foot. So that's not something that there would be a micro-credential about, of course. However, the counterexample is that there's lots and lots of research about wait time, an educator's ability to ask a question and then actually wait 5 to 8 seconds to allow students to talk amongst themselves, to think about their responses, as opposed to always having the question and answer relationship between the teacher and student. And there's research that shows that that practice has an impact on student learning. And so there are micro-credentials on wait time, of course. Then the next thing is that we know that there are multiple ways to learn things. So micro-credentials are by design agnostic as to where and how an educator learns a specific competency or skill. And as I mentioned before, there's lots of ways they can do that in the formal settings, at conferences and workshops and seminars, but they can also learn those things by having conversations online through trial and error in their classroom, and those are all equally valid and important. But where the micro-credential really lives is in this evidence of learning. So after an educator has learned that specific research-backed competency, we are looking for evidence of them implementing that practice in their classroom or in their relationship with teachers or whatever it might be. So and actually collecting that and submitting it and having it assessed, and that's where the micro-credential really lives or focuses on the triangle. And Micro-credentials, by being a technology tool, something that's facilitated by technology, they come in the form of a digital badge. So every micro-credential that an educator earns, and that's each of these little images that you see on the left side of the screen, they have baked into them data on who the educator is that earned it, what the educator did, who awarded it to the educator, et cetera, et cetera. And so they become this, as I mentioned, a piece of currency, but it's a digital piece of currency that can be easily shared, that is transparent as a result of that data. It is highly specific to each individual competency. They're stackable, so you can imagine that an educator could earn one micro-credential on a topic area, like using number lines to teach fractions, or they could earn an entire stack of 6 micro-credentials all within that teaching fractions stack to demonstrate a greater commitment to that content area. And then finally, and we think this is perhaps the most valuable, is that they're portable. So the educator earns them and they can travel with that educator across schools and across districts and across states, but they're also shareable. So an educator can share them with a principal or with an administrator or with their coach or with their students or with their colleagues or with their parents as a way to show, again, who they are and what they know and are able to do in their classroom. So when we started to design this system, we looked at all of the research. If you can see just a few of the citations there at the bottom of this slide to see what we would need to build around. What are the specific characteristics of a high-quality professional learning experience for educators that they don't often receive? So for example, as I mentioned, every micro-credential is research-based. There are actual research citations associated with every single micro-credential in the system telling the educator exactly why this practice is something that is worth them implementing or something that will have an impact on their practice or on their students' outcomes. They're all job embedded because they require actually an educator implementing them. And they're based on those problems of practice. So an educator can select the micro-credential that captures the skill or the challenge that they're tackling right here, right now. They provide opportunities for reflection and feedback. In fact, every micro-credential has a reflection section, and when that micro-credential submission is assessed, the educator receives feedback from the assessor, who's an expert on the back end of the system, that tells them exactly what they can do to improve or validates the work that they've already done. They're content-focused, so they're highly specific. They incorporate active learning. They support collaboration. Some of the most interesting implementations we see is where educators are working together to support each other in earning those micro-credentials, and Jill can tell you a bit about that as well. They use models and modeling of effective practice. So there's always resources or examples that an educator can look to learn more. They provide coaching and expert support. Again, those assessments that I mentioned before. They offer opportunities for feedback and reflection. I mentioned that one again already. And they're of sustained duration, and this is really important, that there is no time limit for an educator to earn a micro-credential. They can work on it and submit it the next day. They can submit it 3 months later. And then if they don't earn it the first time, there's no limit on the number of times that they can resubmit or a limit on the amount of time in between resubmissions either. So we've done our best to design this system to reflect everything that we know about the most powerful professional learning experiences for educators. So micro-credentials fundamentally are a partnership play. The system can't exist without a bunch of really important partners. The first are the issuers. Those are the organizations that develop the micro-credential content, assess the micro-credential submissions, and then award the micro-credentials to the educators. So you see here on the right side of the slide, there's a badge image associated with an Educators Rising micro-credential. In this case, Educators Rising is the issuer of that micro-credential. They looked into their research-backed practices, identified a specific competency with a key method that's also research-backed, and said, developed a micro-credential around that. They then have trained assessors who will receive the evidence that educators submit, assess those against publicly available rubrics, and then they ultimately award them to those educators too. And so the educator that earns this micro-credential walks around with this piece of currency with the Educators Rising logo on it. So it's almost like an endorsement of sorts. The next and arguably most important player in our ecosystem are the earners. Those are the educators that are applying for the micro-credentials, awarding them, sharing them with folks. And we want to be clear that when we think about educators, we're defining it as broadly as possible. So an earner could be a K-12 classroom teacher, they could be an instructor at a community college, they could be an aide in an early childhood classroom, they could be school board members, they could be administrators, librarians, coaches, instructional technology folks. There's a whole broad way that we define educator because this currency, this recognition is valuable regardless of what role you play in the education sector. And then I think many of you are likely associated with these folks are our recognizers. These are the states, districts, and other organizations that provide value for the educator, for the micro-credentials that educators earn. So different things are possible in different places, of course, because of different political realities and federalism. That means that every state has totally different mechanisms. But we work directly with these states, districts, and organizations to figure out what's possible in their setting and provide educators with that value. Now, we have found that for about 10 to 15% of educators, and this is based on research that I'll show in a bit, that there's some intrinsic motivation there. So for them, the value of getting the recognition of earning the micro-credential itself is enough, but for everyone else, there might be a need for extrinsic motivation. That's where the recognizer comes in. And then finally, we have technical partners. Currently, Digital Promise has its own technical platform, and so we are our own technical partner. Digital Promise also thinks of itself, and you'll see that DP in the bottom left-hand corner of this badge, as sort of the almost good housekeeping seal of approval for micro-credentials. So when you see that DP in the bottom left-hand corner, you know that the micro-credential is research-backed, evidence-based, assessment-based, and rigorous. So you know that there's, it's gone through that vetting process. So there's that Digital Promise template and framework that we defined to ensure that that micro-credential is high quality. We also have other technical partners that facilitate micro-credential submission, assessment, and awarding. There are Digital Promise micro-credentials currently on a Bloomboard platform. The National Education Association has their own platform with Digital Promise micro-credentials. And then we have some other more specific partners as well. So as I mentioned, Digital Promise developed this framework and template for a micro-credential. So essentially, what is the DNA or the components of a micro-credential that we think need to be there for it to be rigorous and high quality? So I just want to walk through quickly what you will see in every micro-credential, because our goal is for an educator to go to a micro-credential and understand exactly what they're going to see before they even get there. So the first component of a micro-credential is the competency, and we think of this as the what an educator is being asked to demonstrate. So in my example earlier, that's wait time. An educator is being asked to demonstrate wait time, ask a question, and waiting 5 to 8 seconds. The key method is the how. So in the case of wait time, the what and the how are pretty much the same. There's one method to implement wait time, which is asking that question and waiting 5 to 8 seconds. However, there are other competencies for which there may be multiple key methods. So checking for understanding is a great example where an educator can check for understanding. There's probably 20 different ways that I'll have research to back them up. There's exit tickets and asking a student to come on the whiteboard, asking students to gesture, asking direct questions, et cetera, et cetera. So you could imagine a world in which there's a whole stack of checking for understanding micro-credentials, and each one captures a different key method. Then there's the method components, and those method components basically embellish on that key method and tell an educator exactly what an assessor is looking to see in their submission. Then there's the research and resources. So the research, again, are those direct citations that an educator can look to understand why they are being asked to do the specific method, what value it brings. And then there's resources, which tell the educator where they can start to learn more about that specific competency and key method. It's important to note, however, that micro-credentials are not courses. They're not meant to be the learning experience themselves. Again, educators can learn that specific skill however they want to go about it. However, there is, of course, always learning that happens through the process of collecting the evidence, of submitting it, of getting that feedback as well. But the resources are meant to be a starting point. And then there's the submission criteria and the scoring rubric, and this really is the heart of the micro-credential. So the submission criteria tell the educator exactly what they're asked to submit to demonstrate competence, and this always goes back to the research. So for example, with wait time, the best way to know if an educator can actually ask a question and wait 5 to 8 seconds before asking a follow-up is to see them doing it. So the main piece of evidence for that micro-credential is a video of the educator in their classroom during instruction. For other micro-credentials, the research suggests that the best way to know if something's happening is something completely different. So for example, for our deeper learning micro-credentials, all the research on deeper learning suggests that the best way to know if it successfully happened is to look at the student work. So for the purposes of those micro-credentials, the primary piece of evidence is that student work that the educator is asked to submit. And then every micro-credential has a scoring rubric associated with it that an educator can see from the get-go to understand exactly what success looks like and how they're going to be assessed before they even go about collecting their evidence. So I'm just glancing really quickly at the chat. So Steve Goss here asks if a micro-credential is a documentation of participation in a learning experience, and it's actually not. It's documentation of the application of that learning. So we're not asking the educator to prove that they participated in a learning experience. We're asking them to go back to their classroom after that learning experience and implement in their practice exactly what they were studying or what they were trying to do. And then Jamie asks, are micro-credentials crafted and written for specific roles? So I would say that depends. There are some that are sort of by necessity targeted at specific roles. So those ones for school board members are really very specific to school board members. But there are lots of micro-credentials that have applications across roles in a building. So for example, we have a stack on data literacy that could be used by a classroom teacher, by a coach, or by an administrator, anyone for whom using that data would be relevant. So it's really content specific to answer that question. And then Kathy asks about recommendations for a company to work with to utilize micro-credentials. Kathy, I would love to chat with you more to understand, separate from this, what you're looking for. Our work with issuers of micro-credentials is something that we've done for a very long time, but I find that it's typically the most effective to have one-on-one conversations to understand what your needs are. All right, so I talked a bit about this before, but we just want to make very clear that there is a huge world of what the potential artifacts and evidence are that an educator could submit. So the most common are typically videos and student work. However, depending on a specific competency, it could be many other things. So for example, we have a stack of micro-credentials on virtual community organizing, and in that case, the submission is actually the transcript from that virtual community or a video from that virtual community. So if it's a webinar, you might submit the video of the webinar. If it's a Twitter chat, you might submit the actual Twitter transcript as well. So it really varies widely, and we are very upfront in acknowledging that we may not have fully reached the limits of what potential pieces of artifacts and evidence would be for micro-credentials because the system is constantly growing and evolving. We have a couple of questions about accounts and storage. So the micro-credential platform that we operate does require a teacher to create an account to submit evidence and have it assessed and earn that micro-credential. Any educator can go into that system completely for free to earn those micro-credentials. And once a micro-credential is earned, it goes into that educator's profile on the back end. It's also saved to the Badger backpack. And Badger right now is sort of the preeminent badging platform internationally. And so by being on Badger, educators are able to collect micro-credentials or badges from lots of different systems, not just the Digital Promise system. But yes, it is really meant to be a full-service system where educators can then share and store and collect there as well. Right. And then Don asks about if a school sets up a micro-credential, does Digital Promise approve it? So there are lots of systems that allow schools. Canvas is one of them that has a very developed badge awarding system right now, where any school could create their own micro-credential at any time and awards to their educators or even their students to be included in the Digital Promise ecosystem and on our platform, yes, there is sort of a vetting process that goes through, and I'm happy to have any conversations with folks offline to dive deeper into these questions. All right, so I talked briefly about the assessment process, but I'd like to dive in a little deeper. So we think that there are 4 ways that assessment happens. Right now, far and away, the most common is free assessment. So when a microcredential first appears on our platform, it's in what is called the calibration period. So over the course of the first 50 submissions, that microcredential is available for educators to earn for free. Once that microcredential reaches 50 submissions, the issuer is able to look at all of those submissions and make any amendments to the microcredential content that they see fit. So for example, they might determine that that the rubric is not effective, or that they need to better explain what evidence that they're looking for, or they need to build out their key method a little bit more. So they see that over the course of those first 50 submissions. And then at that point, the microcredential can become a paid microcredential. So that issuer can decide to associate an assessment fee with the microcredential that pays for the human being on the back end to assess it. At this point, we found that most issuers go with an assessment fee between $25 and $40, and that mostly reflects the complexity of the assessment itself and how much time it takes. We also believe that there's great promise around peer assessment. There's a lot of research to suggest that educators are really effective at peer assessment in their professional learning. However, we do not yet have the technological capabilities around peer assessment. And then the final piece is what we call certified assessment. So let's say that a specific school district or a state wanted to use microcredentials, but they wanted to facilitate their own assessment process. The issuers of those microcredentials could then certify assessors, coaches, for example, in that district to assess on their behalf and award their microcredentials. So that is another process that currently exists and is facilitated through our system. And then I realized I missed a question here. Someone asked for an example of a key method. So I think the example I gave previously about checking for understanding is a good one. So that checking for understanding could be the competency, but you can imagine multiple key methods. So there could be one key method on checking for understanding using exit tickets. And then the method components would describe all of the research-backed components of an effective exit ticket. Or there could be another microcredential on asking direct questions. That could be another key method. And then the method components would describe all of the research-backed characteristics of effective direct questions to check for understanding. And that's a pretty micro-credential, but is a very good understanding of how the research can go directly into a key method, and that it's possible to have multiple key methods for a single competency. So I wanted to share a bit about our usage statistics. As I mentioned before, there is a wide variety of different places where educators can find microcredentials that are part of the Digital Promise ecosystem. These numbers attempt to sort of combine all of those. So we've seen at this point that the storefront, the place where an educator can select a microcredential that they want to earn, receives as many as 16,000 unique monthly visitors. So over the course of a month, as many as 16,000 and perhaps now even more educators are visiting the storefront. We've had nearly 3,500 unique users apply for a microcredential. There have been 11,000 submissions, so that shows you that a lot of educators are applying for multiple microcredentials, or that they have not earned the microcredential the first time around and are applying or resubmitting again. And then we do see, and this is actually a surprising number for us, we see about a 55% pass rate. When we first embarked on this journey, if you will, we imagined that it would reflect more of a normal curve, that perhaps we'd see about a 66% pass rate, that 2/3 of the submissions would pass and 1/3 would not pass the first time around. And that turns out to not be the case, that the microcredentials are a little more challenging than we might have first expected, and that there is more of a learning curve for educators than we initially anticipated either. We've had microcredential applicants from over 550 districts across the country, and there are over 50 nonprofit and for-profit issuing organizations as well. There are currently 11 states that offer CEUs and many more pending approval. So that means for educators in those states, they can earn a micro-credential and submit the proof of their micro-credential to earn continuing education units or professional development points or whatever it might be. That is not possible in every state. In some states, the individual districts have the right to award continuing education units. So in that case, we might work with an individual district to figure out that process. And then in other places, they really don't have a system around continuing education units at all, in which case we have to look to other options. There are 7 states that have state-level initiatives currently. I'll talk a bit more in a bit about some of the findings from those state-level initiatives, but they vary very widely. Some of them are more wide open and broad and allow educators to select whatever they want. Others are much more focused on a specific need or a specific pathway for an educator. And then some are tied specifically to figuring out relicensure. So seeing if there's a way to replace the system of continuing education units or PDPs for relicensure with other options for educators, or I should say embellish, not necessarily replace. And then also there are 50 districts, actually more than 50 now, that have formal implementation programs either around CEUs or pilots and otherwise. So back in 2015, Digital Promise did a nationally representative study of educators to understand how they perceived micro-credentials and what their interest would be in them. So we saw that at least 70% were somewhat or more interested in engaging with micro-credentials, and 65% said that they were at least somewhat likely to try to earn a micro-credential. Now, this was a few years ago, so awareness around micro-credentials is much higher, and the value for micro-credentials is much more present in more states. But we found these numbers to be very reassuring. So of those 65%, and this is how we sort of think about adoption of micro-credentials. So 31% said that they were extremely or very likely to try to earn a micro-credential. We consider these sort of our early adopters. And we saw among these people they were motivated by that desire to learn. They were less driven by extrinsic considerations. They were the most engaged in PD activities, and they were most likely to be satisfied by those PD activities. So we know that there's something a little bit different about those early adopters than what we see as our mainstream adopters, that other 34% that are somewhat interested. They might need, for example, those extrinsic motivations. And then we saw that that final 35% are not likely to try at that point. And again, this was in 2015, and we consider these our late adopters, or the folks for whom having more structured systems and values and recognition for micro-credentials will be really important. Looking at the question here, what percent of teachers resubmit their evidence if they don't pass the first time around? So this is actually a really interesting finding. Of the educators that don't earn their micro-credential the first time around, we see about 50% of them resubmit. And what's particularly interesting is of that 50%, only about 55%, of that same passing rate again, are successful the first time around. So we don't see a learning curve like we would expect in that second submission. And we have a few theories as to why that might be, which might be that instead of really retackling their submission, educators are just making tiny tweaks to their original submission in hopes that they would meet the assessor's feedback, but may not actually get there. And then we see, and we've had educators resubmit as many as 6 times. We see that each time that passing rate, or the resubmission rate continues to be 50%, and the passing rate never gets really higher than 66%, no matter how many times an educator resubmits. So there is more to learn, I think, about what goes into the resubmission process and how educators can increase their success. In terms of the states that accept micro-credentials for CEUs, I'm going to do my best to name them off the top of my head, though I'm not likely to get all 11. So they are Wyoming, Maryland, North Carolina, Illinois, Florida, Wyoming, Washington, This is something, I will have to go back and have the REL, when they post this, provide that information here. Maybe we can amend a slide or something like that. So I apologize if we don't have that information off the top of my head, but happy to share. Kim, you're also welcome to reach out to me directly, and I can get you that list. And then I think I addressed Carol's question around CEUs. However, just to dive a little more deeply, we do look at each microcredential to capture the complexity of the evidence that the educator is being asked to submit, and we make a recommendation, which we then confirm with each issuer to sort of capture the number of hours. So though we really want to move away from the C10 system, we understand that it's one of the only things possible in a lot of states and districts right now, and so we do provide that recommendation for the number of hours. However, it is important to note that that number of hours for CEUs, that recommendation is based on the amount of time that it would take an educator to implement and collect the evidence, not the amount of time that it would take an educator to learn a skill, because that is so highly variable by educators. And so I just got a great idea from the folks at the REL, which is that I will put the list of states that award CEUs in the chat for folks to see later once we switch over to Jill's presentation. So keep an eye out for that in a little bit, Kim. So it will probably not shock folks to learn that there's not a ton of research out there on the impact of microcredentials, and a big part of that is because it's so new, and impact studies take a lot of time and a lot of data. However, there is one really interesting early finding that I wanted to share with folks, and this is out of the Friday Institute at North Carolina State. And the Friday Institute is one of our longest and earliest partners in microcredentials. And they have microcredentials both that any educator can earn directly through our platform, but also microcredentials that are embedded in a MOOC that they provide on learning differences. So an educator could opt into participating in that MOOC. And in one of their recent implementations of that MOOC, they did a bit of A/B testing, where half of the educators that participated in the MOOC and then also were asked to apply for a microcredential. And then the other half of the educators in the MOOC were given all of the other treatment that did not engage in the microcredential. And what they saw, and this is the most interesting piece under success, is that the educators that participated in the microcredential received higher scores on their rubrics at the end of the time. So they were able to show with statistical significance that participating in the microcredential increased the educator's likelihood of successfully implementing that skill. And they unfortunately didn't see any impact on persistence, so the rate at which educators completed the course, or engagement. So the rate at which educators kept coming back for more. However, there is much, much, much more research to be done. So let me actually quickly, so it looks like I'm missing a slide here, but let me talk a bit about the categories of research that we think are relevant. So the first category of research is what we think of as user behavior research. So what can we learn just by virtue of the data in the system about who the educators are that are earning the microcredentials, which microcredentials they're most likely to engage in, which microcredentials they're most likely to be successful at, and where those educators might be coming from. So are they from specific parts of the country? Are they of a specific demographic background? Do they teach specific subjects or specific grades? So that is sort of that first, the sort of who and the what and the when of microcredentials is the user behavior research. The next piece is what we call impact research, and this is what this Friday Institute study is trying to get at, which is to what degree does participating in microcredentials have an impact on a teacher's practice or on other outcomes, like in the long-term student outcomes, but also things like retention or feelings of self-efficacy or satisfaction with your job, because we do think that in the long run, microcredentials could have an impact on those things as well. And then the last piece is translational research. So by virtue of having microcredentials, what can we learn about how educators learn and what those most effective professional learning engagements might be? So if you are providing a MOOC, for example, And then you have the educators engage in micro-credentials. The micro-credentials can provide you evidence of the impact of that MOOC. Or similarly, you could imagine using micro-credentials to demonstrate or understand the impact of a PLC implementation or some other implementation. So that's that last piece, is the translational research that we would love to see done. Of course, a lot of this research requires not just time and funding, but also participation in a lot of data. And so those are things that we hope to tackle in the coming years. So I wanted to dive a bit more into recognition and what we've seen possible out there. So again, recognition, or what's the incentives or the extrinsic value that a state or a district or an organization can offer to an educator for earning the micro-credentials. So first, there's of course that intrinsic value that I want to learn and I want to be recognized for it, and I want to be able to show who I am and what I know and I'm able to do. The next is sharing. So an educator can put on their profile or on their signature or on their resume or on their LinkedIn or on their website. We've also seen, I love this, in many districts, educators print out their micro-credentials and put them on their nameplate by their classroom door. So even as you're walking down the hall, you know what micro-credentials that educator has earned. And so there's value there as well. From the more extrinsic sense, there's pay, so salaries or stipends. We've seen implemented to provide value for micro-credentials. There's continuing education units, so as I mentioned before, sort of translating the micro-credentials into seat time. And then there's relicensure, so can you build micro-credentials into the relicensure system, excuse me. And then the thing that I am arguably most excited about is this concept of career pathways. So could a district or a state chart out a pathway of micro-credentials for an educator to become a teacher leader or a coach or a mentor? So a competency-based way for an educator to get more responsibility and more compensation and continue to travel up that career ladder without necessarily leaving the classroom. And so there's possibilities there. The final thing that's actually not on here is what sort of non-governmental agencies can do. So for example, we're working with National Geographic on micro-credentials. And we see that National Geographic is actually creating a certification for educators that earn all of the micro-credentials in their stack. So if you earn all 6 National Geographic micro-credentials, you get a certificate that says that you are a National Geographic framework certified educator. I mean, those sorts of things, especially from organizations like National Geographic, have a lot of value for educators, and they can translate it into other opportunities as well. There's a lot of ways for folks to think about recognition. So I mentioned before that we've seen some findings around state implementations, and here's sort of an overview here. And Jill is actually going to talk about what each of these things look like in Baltimore County. But the first is to decide on your purpose. We've seen that the most successful implementations, both at the state and district level, are when the state or district go into it knowing what they're trying to achieve, knowing exactly what challenge or what goal they're trying to reach, and scaffolding the micro-credentials up to reach that identified goal. Going into it sort of willy-nilly because you think this is a cool idea is probably not going to guarantee folks for success. The next is to start small. We always recommend that states or districts start with a pilot with a smaller number of educators. Obviously, the definition of small varies based on by the size of the district. In a large district like Baltimore County, they started with 200 educators. In smaller districts, like one we're working with in Vermont right now, they're starting with 20. So it really depends on how you define small, but we definitely don't recommend diving in with a whole district implementation. The next is to provide choice, but not too much. And I refer to this often as bounded choice. So sending educators out to all 350 plus micro-credentials is usually not going to be a great option because it becomes very overwhelming very quickly. But similarly, providing educators with one micro-credential that they can earn is also going to, out of necessity, exclude some educators. So for example, we had one district that had all of the educators earn a micro-credential on data literacy. However, for the arts and music educators, they didn't have assessments that they could use to derive data from, and so they weren't able to apply it. They were necessarily excluded from the implementation. So providing a bounded choice, so we say it's typically 16 to 20 microcredentials, feels about right, so that educators can specifically select what they need, but that's still tied to the greater goal, is a good way to go. And then keep an eye on the score. So the states found that keeping a close eye on how the educators are doing on the microcredentials, so understanding who's earning, who's not earning, how the implementation is going is really important, so that you can always check in and understand, maybe we're not setting these educators up for success. How can we get them better adapted to this idea? How can we pull in their principals so that they can be supportive as well? And then the last piece, and this sounds obvious, but often isn't, is communicate, communicate, communicate. That keeping in touch with educators, and Jill did some great things with Twitter chats and what have you, is really valuable so that the educators feel heard and understood throughout the process. So I am over my time, but I just wanted to give everyone the URL for our platform. It's microcredentials.digitalpromise.org. I believe it was in the chat earlier as well. But that's a place where any educator can go right now and view all 350 plus microcredentials, as well as create an account and start submitting and earning. And then Allison asked if anyone's offering microcredentials for school leader competencies. Yes. So you can find them on the platform. Some of them are explicitly about leadership, and then some of them are sort of can be tied in. So the data literacy microcredentials, for example, are very relevant, we found, for school leaders. And then Gretchen also asked, what methods do you use to deliver the content, which methods are best received? And that sounds to me like a question about the learning experience as opposed to the microcredential itself. And so we are looking to understand more about what's the most effective way to deliver learning, but that's definitely not a part of the microcredential platform itself. So I'm sure that more questions will pop up. And yes, Amy, there are microcredentials for special teachers like special education, music, art, and PE. We actually have a great case study on a PE educator who implemented deeper learning with his physical education students. So though they may not be labeled PE, they have implications across content areas. All right, and that is it for me. Folks can feel free to reach out to me directly. There's my email address there, jennifer@digitalpromise.org. Thank you all so much for the time, and I believe we'll have time at the end as well to answer more questions. So I'll pass it back.
Yes, thank you so much, Jennifer. Hi, everybody. This is Candace Bocala. I am just going to introduce our next speaker, who will be Jill Snell. But before I do that, I wanted to do a little poll for our audience, just to ask if anybody out there has either worked on or applied for a microcredential. So go ahead and put your answers in the poll. Right now, the data seem to be looking like we've got about 80% of people who said no, about 20% of people who said yes, and those numbers seem to be staying about the same. We got some late arrivals to the yes of, yes, I have applied for a microcredential, or I'm working on a microcredential. So that's really interesting to kind of get a sense of where our audience is. So with that, we're going to go ahead and end the poll and go back to our next presenter, Jill Snell, who is coming to us from Baltimore County Public Schools. Go ahead, Jill.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be with you all today. Again, my name is Jill Snell, and I served as the BCPS point person for our microcredentialing initiative. I found the best part of microcredentials and microcredentialing is the celebration of teachers. So we wanted to celebrate those of you who have engaged in the microcredentialing process, which looks like about 20%. And I have a feeling that the 80% that hasn't, that's a yet. So I have a feeling if we were to do this again in a couple months, maybe that 20% would be up a little bit. So thank you so much for being with us today. So I'm going to work through the 5 themes that were identified from the American Institute for Research study. deciding on your purpose, starting small, providing choice, keeping an eye on the score, and then, of course, communication. I'm going to work through what those themes look like in practice in Baltimore County. So the first one we're going to hit on is purpose. As part of the League of Innovative Schools, BCPS was approached by Digital Promise to engage in a micro-credentialing pilot in the spring of 2016. After a lot of conversation and careful consideration, we determined that micro-credentials could be a strategy to enhance the personalized professional learning program in our district. So while we offered many traditional opportunities like courses and book studies, workshops, there was very little offerings for truly personalized learning for our educators. And when we say personalized learning, we mean where educators have choice over content, time, place, how, and who they prefer to learn from. Early in the process, my colleague Amanda and I realized that we needed to establish a common language around micro-credentialing. So we had come to a point in our planning where we were just not making progress, and we needed to discuss the questions that you see above. And I remember specifically we were at a badging conference out in California, and I looked at Amanda and pointed to a question that I had written on my sticky note, which was, is the badge the same as a micro-credential? Is a micro-credential another name for a badge? And the reason why we were stalling in our planning is because what I was referencing as a micro-credential, Amanda was referencing as a badge. So we had to come to a general understanding that a micro-credential was recognized by a badge, but not all badges represented micro-credentials. Ultimately, we also decided that we were not trying to establish a district-wide badging system at that time, but we were really trying to focus on micro-credentials as a form of personalized professional learning. As Jennifer said, we really did want to start small, but small in our district is probably large in others. We recruited through our school-based professional development teachers, so we're fortunate to have a full-time professional development teacher in all 175 buildings. So they were really our point of contact at the school level. And we launched in only a select number of the 175 schools and centers that we have. So about 86 people were initially interested after attending a face-to-face launch event that we hosted. And in that launch event is when folks really had an opportunity to learn more about what a micro-credential is and how the pilot process would work. Based on current district initiatives, we narrowed down the micro-credentialing options to about 20 micro-credentials. One of the things that we had to consider, and I know that this had come up in a question earlier in the chat box, was we really did have to consider that our learners or educators were teachers in and out of the classroom. So at first when we chose the micro-credentials for our initial list or initial offering, we forgot to include folks that were outside of the classroom. So we had to go back into the catalog per se, or the options per se, and find some micro-credentials that would work for folks that weren't working directly with children. Oops, so it looks like the top part is cut off there. So I will, or it looks like somebody might already be putting the tiny URL in the chat box. So if you want to see some of our resources, we tried to curate as much as possible, knowing that not only was this a learning opportunity for us, but this is also a learning opportunity for a lot of other folks as well. So what that website is up at the top, it's www.tinyurl.com/BCPS-micro. Thank you, Ashley. So in there you'll find lots of different resources. You'll find flyers that we sent out. You'll find video tutorials that we created, and that's not even everything that we have. And we're definitely willing and happy to share anything that that you're potentially looking for. The slide above shows the process that our educators engaged in. So first they would select a microcredential, and then they dug deeper into the learning. They collected evidence along the way. The next step was to upload the evidence into the platform. They then received feedback, and then, like I said, the best part was the celebration when they earned a microcredential, and sometimes it was they needed to act on the feedback first by revising, going back, learning more, resubmitting, and then we would get to the celebration part when they earned the microcredential. We also asked them to send the evidence of the earned microcredential to the pilot manager, which was me, and then I took care of submitting the paperwork for CPD credit. You can see in the box on the slide that it says that our educators were eligible to receive 1 continuing professional development credit for every 2 microcredentials earned. And I will emphasize the earned piece. That's why it's in all caps. They had to earn the microcredential in order to be eligible for the CPD credit. That didn't mean start or apply and not earn. They had to show evidence of earning the microcredential to be eligible for the CPD credit. And also, I'll also mention around celebration. Jennifer mentioned this earlier, but we celebrated our educators on Twitter. We sent them an individual email. We created badge boards so that educators could display their earned microcredentials on a piece of cardstock that we had created where they could put a sticker that represented their badge on it so that when folks either walked by their classroom or walked into their classroom, they would see it and ask them about it. So in the research findings, the score theme refers to the actual scoring of the microcredentials. While we encouraged our participants to start by looking at the rubrics and work backwards, we were not scoring the MCs or the microcredentials. We did, however, keep records so that we could determine if there were ever inconsistencies with scoring. And just some examples of the record keeping, because we knew we had so much to learn, I kept record of everything. Attendance at the launch event, interest after the launch, survey completion, meetup participation, if they attempted a microcredential, when they earned a microcredential, if they provided any kind of feedback at all, any emails that I received, and then if there was any notes that I wanted to take. I kept that all in this big, giant spreadsheet. And through that data collection and then data analysis, we were able to identify trends based on putting all of that information together. For example, there was one particular issuer that was not returning feedback in a timely manner to our educators. And so after noticing that trend, we decided that when we would move into the next year of the program, we wouldn't include that particular issuer in the next round. So I attended a microcredentialing webinar with Karen Cator, who's President and CEO of Digital Promise, very early on in our planning process. I had asked for one piece of advice going into the pilot, and without hesitation, Karen replied, communication. She said, keep in frequent contact with your people to learn as much as you can, and that is exactly what we did. We sent emails. We had a website, we had an in-person launch, we have online meetups, we issued surveys. I was constantly checking in through email, so we had lots of opportunities for communication. It was also important for us to communicate with some other stakeholders. Particularly the Maryland State Department of Education and our teachers union, the Teachers Association of Baltimore County. We wanted to make sure that we fell within the guidelines of the master agreement, so communication with the teachers union was key. We also reached out to the Maryland State Department of Education for guidance around earning CPD credit, And they were so interested and on board with micro-credentialing that they actually added micro-credentialing to their platform so that any educator in Maryland, not just our educators in Baltimore County, could earn CPD credit for micro-credentials earned. So just some of the quantitative data. At the end of our pilot year, 43 micro-credentials were earned. And again, remember, this is just from April to June. So 43 micro-credentials were earned by our educators. 86 folks participated in the pre-pilot survey. About 42 responded to the post-survey. And then a majority of our respondents reported that they were extremely likely to continue, which was important for us to know because you heard Jennifer say that time is a variable when it comes to micro-credentials. So with a pilot, we had to put time constraints. And so it was important for us to know that a majority of our people still wanted to continue, which is why we went into a second-year pilot, not with Digital Promise, but within our district. Some of the qualitative data, our folks liked that it was personalized, that it was small and student-centered. They liked that their skills were recognized, the skills that they already had, but they were recognized and celebrated. And they also felt that this type of professional development was much more meaningful. So as I mentioned, our educators said that they were interested in continuing, so we chose to continue into a pilot year 2. But again, to try to tweak things a little bit to learn as much as we can. So we decided to try stacking. So the process was the same for our educators, except they chose a stack of micro-credentials around a particular topic. And in order to earn 1 CPD credit, this time around, they had to complete 3 micro-credentials within that same stack. So where are we now? We have really moved in Baltimore County from the what, so micro-credentials being the what we were focusing on, to now moving into the how. So the what are things like formative assessment and responsive instruction, improving our advanced academics program, working with our school-based librarians. And so we've really transitioned from really focusing on micro-credentials as the what of this is what we're trying to do, to then utilizing micro-credentials as how we get to the what. So, for example, we're working with Towson University right now to build some micro-credentials to support formative assessment and responsive instruction, and to get those micro-credentials recognized for graduate credit. We are in a partnership with the National Association for Gifted Children, working with our advanced academics teachers to do some micro-credentialing around our Gifted and Talented or Advanced Academics program. And then we're also in a partnership with Future Ready Librarians who have created and are issuing micro-credentials for school-based media specialists. So I would say at this point, that's where we really are in Baltimore County, where we feel like we've learned a lot about micro-credentials, and now we're thinking about how we can apply micro-credentials in getting us to the outcomes that we're looking for. So I thought there would be a question slide after that. So
thanks, Jill. This is Candace. Yeah, we can pause here for questions. So
okay.
Questions for either Jill or Jennifer. Somebody who it doesn't really matter. You can bring both of them back in. We do have a question from somebody in the chat. What funding resources were used for the BCPS pilot?
So
and I think that would be for you, Jill.
Yep. There was no funding needed. So because we were in a pilot, and all of the micro-credentials that our educators engaged in were in that first phase where there was no fee. There was no funding source that we needed. So it was our own offices that were the program managers, and the micro-credentials were free for our educators to engage in.
Great. Thank you, Jill. Another question has come in. Have you seen any differences in context for the type of micro-credentials needed? This might be for Jennifer. Rural education versus urban, elementary versus secondary.
That is a fantastic question, Linda. So yes and no. So we have, and there's someone from a Kentucky education collaborative, I think, on the webinar. I remember that coming up earlier, but we've done a lot of work with folks in the Quebec region, so that's the Kentucky Valley Education Cooperative, around implementing micro-credentials as resources and tools for educators in highly, highly rural, isolated areas, and have found that they're a tremendous tool as well. And so we highly recommend micro-credentials in rural areas because it allows educators to collaborate sort of across space and distance and to overcome some of the challenges that they face by not having a high quality institution down the street or access to the local NGO that provides PD, et cetera, et cetera. So we've seen a lot of success there. At the same time, we've seen a lot of success in urban districts, but the implementation often is a little bit different. And actually, a lot of Jill's findings can really be traced there, that you can use a lot of these tools that might already exist to bring your educators together, even if they are in a more physically proximate space than they might be in a rural district. The elementary versus secondary findings are really, really interesting as well. So we've seen great engagement, particularly with elementary teachers, because they're able to find something in the micro-credential platform that applies regardless of the subject area. So a lot of our micro-credentials may not be subject area specific, and so educators that might be focusing on challenges in different subject areas can all be earning the same micro-credential at the same time and supporting each other because they have that space to do so through the micro-credentials. High school educators also seem to be very excited about micro-credentials, but for slightly different reasons, which is that, particularly around the student reflection, that it encourages the high school educators to get their students engaged in their own learning experiences. So that's a really interesting sort of finding there. So I guess, which is all to say that we're still learning a lot about this question. There seem to be key differences about what sort of gets people excited about micro-credentials based on the context, but we see that there is great applications across these contexts.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Another question has come in. What was Baltimore's process for developing the content that formed the basis for the engagement, the content of the course or experiences available?
Hi, Diana. Thank you for the question. Can you tell me a little bit more, or maybe phrase it in a different way? I want to make sure that I understand what you're asking. This is Jill.
Great. Well, while we have Diana rephrase her question, the next question from Steve is, are these micro-credentials replacing continuing ed courses at higher ed institutions?
Steve, that's a really interesting question. This is Jennifer, and I'll jump in here, though I think Jill might have some interesting comments based on the work that you're doing with Towson. So we generally work with districts to think about micro-credentials not as a wholesale replacement for the professional learning that they typically engage in, but an embellishment or perhaps even a authentic performance assessment. So we work with the Center for Collaborative Education out of Boston, and they talk about micro-credentials, and they have micro-credentials on performance assessment as sort of this great sort of meta performance assessment. So can you have a performance assessment for the art or the craft of creating performance assessments? So you could imagine that an educator could engage in any professional learning experience and then apply for that micro-credential to get that competency-based recognition or credit for it. So it still, in fact, allows an educator to be engaging with a continuing ed course in a higher ed institution if they so choose, but the focus then is not, did they get that non-degree bearing graduate credit? The focus becomes, can they implement that skill in their practice? At the same time, we also want to acknowledge that there are a wide variety of ways that educators can learn things, and so to sort of break down the requirements that they engage in that continuing education course, but that they can engage in learning in other ways too. So it's not necessarily a replacement. It can be a yes and, as we often call it at Digital Promise, but it is really expanding the opportunities. I do know that some districts see it as a way to sort of be more flexible about what educators are able to engage in and where their financial investments might go as a result. So, for example, educators often have to pay a significant amount of money to participate in that continuing ed course and then get the non-degree bearing credit, and micro-credentials give allow them to break out of that as well.
Thank you. So Diana has clarified her question, and she writes, teachers selected, I think in the Baltimore example, teachers selected from a list of micro-credential opportunities. So who created them, aligned the content, demonstrated what educators needed to do to demonstrate competency?
Thank you, Diana. So we chose from a list that was provided to us from Digital Promise in partnership with the platform that we were using at the time, Bloomboard. And so we are not creators. We, as in Baltimore County Public Schools, we did not create our own micro-credentials. As much as we would love to be able to do that, and we are a very large district, we don't have the capacity to do that at this point, especially that number of micro-credentials. So the 20 micro-credentials that we chose were already created by a variety of issuing agencies. And so they were responsible for designing the micro-credential, aligning the content. They created the rubrics that went along with the micro-credentials, and then they were assessing and issuing the micro-credentials.
Can I jump in on that, Jill, really quickly, just to clarify? So when I was talking about the issuers at the front, it is pretty uncommon in our system that districts or states themselves are the issuers. The issuers typically are nonprofit, professional development providers, institutions of higher education, ed tech companies, organizations in general. So it's rare that it's a district, and it's rare that it would never be an individual, because we want the issuing micro-credentials to have sort of audiences and cachet in the community. We want their brands to be of value when an educator earns that micro-credential. So this is typically what Jill just described, what the vast majority of our partners do, is that they look through the existing micro-credentials to select the ones that align with their specific district goals. There are some cases where a district or state might commission the creation of micro-credentials specific to their goals, but that's definitely not common.
Great, thanks for that clarification. So there's a kind of a related question about, did you essentially earn every micro-credential to be sure the credentials you offer or recommend are relevant and aligned with what you would want to offer your teachers? So how did you know that those micro-credentials were relevant and aligned?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Leah. No, I did not earn every micro-credential that we offered to our educators. Remember, we were part of a pilot, and that pilot process, you go in knowing that everybody is learning. So Digital Promise was learning, Baltimore County was learning, Bloomboard was learning, our educators were learning, and so that was really the focus of that process. I will say, though, I did go through the process of earning 3 micro-credentials. I felt like it was important for me to do that, because I wanted to make sure that our educators knew that I also valued the process, and I wanted to practice what I preach, and I wanted to lead by example, and I wanted to be able to empathize with them in going through the process. So I did go through the process 3 times myself. but I chose micro-credentials that were relevant to my work in adult learning.
Thanks, Jill. So we have a question about research, a couple of questions about research, actually. One of them is a general question about what research questions do you think we could explore or that you are exploring to consider the long-term impact of micro-credentials and other competency-based professional development?
Oh, gosh. Do you have 3 hours? Because I'd love to talk about this more in depth. So we think the sky is sort of the limit on the research questions. Some of the potential impacts we think, sort of the early ones that we would like to understand better, are the impact that micro-credentials have on teachers' senses of self-efficacy and satisfaction in their role and with their professional development. We also want to understand the impact on retention and recruitment that micro-credential implementations have, and then also the impact on collegiality that happens across a district or a school building. And so those are the sort of educator-facing pieces. We do think that there is insight to be had around the impact of micro-credentials for educators on student outcomes, but we think that that's a much longer-term conversation and would require an in-depth micro-credential implementation sort of across the school or across the districts before it can be effectively done. We don't think we're ever going to see, like, this educator earned the wait time micro-credential, and so their students' test scores went up 3 points or something like that, of course. So this is a conversation that we want to be very, very careful about doing, because we see so many great ideas in education get taken down by looking to student outcomes too soon. So we do want to be very careful and conscious there about that process. In terms of research findings on issuer reputation and brand, that is actually the first time that anyone's ever asked about that. It does not currently exist, and I would love to think more about that with you, because I do think that's super interesting. Our initial findings on this reflect that a lot of the brands are regional in nature. So where one organization might have a lot of residents in the South, another organization has a lot of residents in the Pacific Northwest, for example. So that's sort of the primary piece that we've seen there around issuer reputation and brand, but would love to learn more about that.
Great, thank you. I know at the REL we are also very interested in this question of what does the research say and what other kinds of research questions can we explore together about micro-credentials and similar opportunities for professional learning. There is a question about communication. So what strategies besides, I guess, maybe communication and other strategies to help retention, what strategies would you recommend to address earner participation attrition in online PD courses? Slide 12 is a good list, but looking for some elaboration on how these components occur in an online PD experience.
Oh, Stephen, that's a great question. I think, so my inclination, my sort of gut reaction is that extrinsic value and support matters a lot here. The other thing I would say, though, and Jill, I'm wondering if you want to jump in here, is the role that the STAT coaches played in your implementation and how that sort of consistent check-in and touch point supported educators moving forward.
Sure. So as I mentioned, we have a full-time professional development teacher in every building, and we knew that the type of learning that is required for a micro-credential is not typical of what our educators are experiencing, or have experienced for most of their lives, which is a very dependent style of learning where they're told where to show up, they're told sometimes even where to sit, you know, what you're going to learn, who you're going to learn it from, how long you have to learn it. Our adults are very used to that type of learning, and with micro-credentialing, it is a completely different style of learning where the learner really has to take initiative over their own learning. So they're taking initiative over what they want to learn, they're taking initiative over how they want to learn it, how long it's going to take them before they can demonstrate competency. We knew that our folks would need support, and that I, as one person in central office, would not be able to provide that support to all of the schools that we're engaging in our pilot. So as part of the pilot process, we made it a requirement that the professional development teacher, they're called STAT teachers in our district, but the professional development teacher was required to be a part of the pilot in addition to a or multiple classroom teachers. So in order for a school to be participating in the pilot, and by school that could be one professional development teacher, one classroom teacher at minimum, the professional development teacher had to commit to being a part of the pilot so that they could provide almost like a personalized learning coach for the educators, but they were also working to earn the micro-credential as well. And then in terms of, I know you asked about communication, and I believe you specifically used the term course, and so maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more on what you mean. Are you referring to an actual online professional development course and you're looking for communication strategies for that, or are you looking at communication strategies for a micro-credentialing program?
So I think while that respondent is clarifying that question, Jill, there's another question that came in, a couple of questions actually from Cheryl. So one is, are micro-credentials ever bundled together as requirements for leadership roles? And if so, where has this been done?
Sure, yeah, I can do that. So they are not explicitly bundled on our platform for leadership roles. However, there's, as I mentioned before, there's lots of micro-credentials that are relevant for leadership roles. However, we also work with the Illinois Principals Association. They're the Association for Principals in Illinois, as the name suggests, of course. And they have developed their own micro-credential platform that has, in partnership with us, that has micro-credentials explicitly on the core competencies for principals in the state, and now they're working across state lines as well. So they might actually be a great group for you to talk with. If you shoot me an email, Cheryl, it's jennifer@digitalpromise.org. I'm happy to connect you with them.
Great, thank you.
And I want to jump in on Dana's question really quickly because I love it and it's like the perfect question. Would you call micro-credentials a form of personalized learning for adults? And yes, 110%. That's actually our sort of core goal with these micro-credentials is to personalize the learning for educators. So for the first time through micro-credentials, educators can identify what their specific need is based on their own needs, on the needs of their student, based on their own professional learning goals, select the micro-credential aligned with that, and implement it. And that feels so powerful, and we see that, and it actually occurs to me, I'll try to grab this link and put it in the chat. We recently surveyed 25 educators that had earned micro-credentials across the country and captured through video and audio and quotes themes that came from those conversations, and the power of personalization comes out pretty significantly there. So I definitely encourage folks to go hear about that and go listen to it, because we think the best advocates for this system are the educators themselves. So I'll plop that in the chat in just a second.
So we're running short on time for questions, but I want to try to take these last two. A question from Cora. As far as micro-credentials go, is there an accreditation process for the micro-credentials?
Great question. So not at this exact moment, no. There are some institutions of higher education that offer non-degree bearing graduate credit for micro-credentials, and in that case, they've gone through the micro-credentials and sort of said, yes, this is something that we're willing to give credit for, and no, this isn't something. I wouldn't call that accreditation itself. You know, we have looked into accreditation as a potential powerful tool, but found that it's actually not the, it's sort of not the, what's the word? It's not the sort of validation of prominence today. It doesn't seem to be the thing that states or districts rely on significantly, as well as the thing that sort of suggests value for educators anymore.
Thank you. And then there's a kind of terminology question. Please define bundle and bundle versus stack. Thank you.
That's a great question. So bundle is definitely not something that we use typically. That was something that someone said in the questions chat. I would define a bundle as you could imagine grabbing micro-credentials from different stacks and bundled together and say, you know, this is our bundle of teacher leader competencies, or this is our bundle of highly effective administrator competencies, or something like that. A stack typically, and this is a terminology we use much more commonly, is sort of a stack of micro-credentials that are all within the same content area or competency area. So we have a stack on communication skills, and a stack on collaboration skills, and a stack on teaching fractions successfully, and what have you. So that the stack is more the sort of meta unit of measure, or the mega unit of measure for a group of educators. A bundle is something that seems more sort of cross-disciplinary to me if I were to define it as a term we don't usually use.
Great, thank you so much. So we have to move on to conclude our time for today. I can see from the questions that everybody was really engaged and really interested in this topic, so thank you so much for that. Our presenter emails have been listed several times, and I'll give you one more screen at the end that will show it to you. But in the meantime, we also need your feedback. It is really important to our work at the REL, and it helps us learn what is useful to you and what you are taking away from this session today. So please take our survey by clicking on this link. You can also find the link above the chat window in that small box. So please do that before you go today. To contact our presenters, these are our email addresses. You'll also get a copy of this webinar recording and an updated version of the slides that will include some of those slides that might have been missing and fixing the formatting. So we'll also send those along to you. And thank you for attending today. We really appreciate your time and attention, and on behalf of the Professional Learning and Development Research Alliance and REL Northeast Islands and Digital Promise, thank you to you all. So I just want to turn it back to Ashley to add any last thoughts.
Hi, Jenny. I just want to reiterate what Candace said. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. The recording from this webinar will be uploaded to the YouTube channel for the Institute of Education Sciences. You will receive an email when that is up. And again, we will send you an updated version of the slides. And thank you again for participating. It's been a lively and wonderful conversation, lots of great questions. I want to thank Jennifer and Jill for their contributions and presenting. And we hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you at other REL Northeast Islands webinars. Thank you.